In this video, I'm going to dive into some of the brain science behind practicing effectively. My name is Josh Gu, and after years of studying the clarinet with some of the best teachers from around the world, I am excited to be sharing my knowledge with you. So go to QuickStartClarinet.com or check the description on this video to see all of the wonderful resources I have to help you reach your clarinet dreams. And of course, subscribe to this channel for weekly clarinet and music tips and tricks. Have you ever been playing some music and you maybe learned an accidental wrong where you missed a sharp in the key signature and you learned it as a natural, and then you go back and once you realize that it's supposed to be a sharp, it just takes so much effort to change it and play it differently? Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the brain science behind why that happens and what you should be doing to overcome that and hopefully not have that mistake or fix that mistake more easily. So I'm going to start off with a brief and very rudimentary little evolution lesson. Again, I don't know a lot about evolution, so this is like high school-ish level, very rudimentary, but I think it's really helpful to learn. So as humans were evolving and developing, our brains started off much smaller than they are now, and we can see this in things like reptiles and other animals that have smaller and less developed brains. We have our brain stem and sort of like the most centered little bit of our brain that controls our very basic functions like breathing, heart beating, digestion, things like that are very, very simple and very, very necessary to survive. Without that part of the brain, humans would not have survived. Then beyond that, more in the back of our head, in the cerebellum, that's sort of our motor cortex, and that's where we start moving. And that developed later than the very basic, most important functions. Movement was also a very important function, though, and really necessary for our survival as well. Then, beyond that, once we got surviving down and we had sort of a medium-sized brain, I think that's most animals are sort of in this realm of brain development. Later on, we developed the cerebral cortex and the frontal lobes, which is sort of the big part of our brain when you look at the sort of gray matter, squishy parts of the brain. When you think of a brain, like that's our cerebral cortex, the part of our brain that makes us good at thinking and does all the language and all the more sort of advanced stuff that helps with survival but isn't as necessary as moving and breathing and eating, and those really, really important things for survival. Now, the reason why this is significant for us is because when we're playing the clarinet, all of those parts of the brain are involved, but in a little bit different ways. And the thing that's important to remember is that we're not very consciously aware of sort of what the cerebellum's doing, or the brainstem, or those more primitive parts of the brain. We don't have as good of conscious control over those things because those are the things that are sort of more intuitive, more natural, and just have to happen for us to exist. Whereas thinking about notes and rhythms and musicality and playing the clarinet, that's all cerebral cortex stuff that happens more in the advanced part of the brain that we do have more conscious control over. So what practicing is using your conscious brain, your cerebral cortex, to sort of train your motor part of your brain in the cerebellum. Because of course playing the clarinet is moving the fingers, which is movement and motor cortex. The air support is actually the lungs and the breathing. That may be even more primitive because that's breathing. And then there's all of the other stuff of keeping track of the music, that can sometimes happen more at the front of the brain. But it's really, really important that we train those more subconscious parts really effectively, or else they're not going to work well. And that's where the idea of sort of muscle memory comes from, is this more primitive part of the brain is doing these things automatically, just like we breathe and digest automatically. That's what we want to train into our brain and into our finger movement and all of that stuff when we perform. Now, again, that's a very, very simplified explanation of it. That's my simple understanding of it. If you have a better understanding of like the way the brain works and where like these finger motions and things like that come from, feel free to leave a comment. I'm always fascinated to learn more about the brain science behind playing and how all of this stuff works. But let's move on and talk about how we can take advantage of the way our brain works to actually make our practicing a lot more effective. So to simplify this a little bit, I'm going to call like the motor cortex, cerebellum, brainstem, all of the more like primitive brain, I'm going to call that the lizard brain. This actually comes from Michelle Anderson of Clarinet Mentors. She's the first person I've heard talk about this. And I really like that idea where it's the less developed brain. It's more like the brain of a lizard where it's just like eat, move, do what it has to do to survive, and it's more subconscious. The lizard brain is where our muscle memory lives. And then we have the cerebral cortex and everything else, our conscious mind. I'm going to call it the big brain because that's the big part of the brain. Also for the memes of being big brain, I think it's effective. So when we're practicing and when we're learning any piece or even scales or long tones, basically what we're doing is trying to use our big brain to train our lizard brain. I've talked about this extensively in the live weekly warm-up and other warm-up videos that warm-ups are all about building good clarinet playing into ourselves so that when we go to perform or to work on music, even in practice, we have great clarinet playing in our muscle memory. The lizard brain has learned how to play the clarinet well by making a good sound, moving the fingers well, tonguing, all of that stuff is like in the lizard brain so that our big brain can focus on doing what needs to be done in the music. And that's the goal of all practicing, really, is that you want to be using your big brain to analyze the music, figure out the rhythms, figure out the notes, figure out the scales that you may be using, the dynamics, the musicality. The conscious brain is what has to create that image of how the music works. And then the process of practicing is to sort of imprint the image that the big brain has created onto the lizard brain so that you can make it happen every single time. And that is why it's so hard to change an accidental or relearn a mistake that you've made. Say it's supposed to be F sharp, but you've been playing it as F natural. However many times you've played it as F natural, you've trained it into the lizard brain that it's supposed to be F natural. And now your brain has that sort of pathway built up in the muscle memory, and it just automatically F natural, because you've learned it so well. So instead, you have to use your big brain to override the lizard brain, relearn a new pattern, imprint a new image of F sharp. And the most simple, basic way of doing that is to just do many more repetitions as F sharp rather than F. And that will sort of cover up the old version. But just like painting, if you have a dark color of paint or a really strong color of paint, which is that F natural in your lizard brain, and you want to cover it up with a F sharp layer of paint, it's going to take a while. It's going to take many coats to get good coverage and to really cover it up completely. And even then you may see some of the F natural showing through, and every now and then you still play F natural rather than F sharp. So that's one way, is to just cover it up and hope that it sticks and covers it up nicely just by doing lots of repetitions. However, we can take advantage of this big brain versus lizard brain and actually do it even more effectively. This might be putting some primer on first before you put the new coat of paint, or sanding off the old paint before you put on the new coat of paint. And the way that we do this is by breaking the pattern. So if you play this one measure and you've always practiced it a measure at a time, and you always play that F natural there, and you're trying to change it to an F sharp, what you can do instead of just playing the measure over and over and hoping that it covers up the F natural with an F sharp, is you can actually break it and force your lizard brain to reconsider it. The way to do this, an easy way to do this, is to do a different chunk. So if you do the whole measure, maybe start in the middle of the measure and go to the middle of the next measure. Your lizard brain knows the measure. That's what you've practiced all the time. That's what you've imprinted onto it, is the whole measure of music. If you, instead of trying to cover up the measure with a new measure of music with the F natural instead, and instead put on a new print just a little bit adjacent to it, where it's a different chunk of the measure, that will actually catch on stronger because it's a new pattern that's forming and overriding, rather than trying to override the old pattern with basically the same pattern. Doing little different chunks like that is a great way to fix mistakes. Another way that you can break the pattern is doing different tempos. So slowing it down a lot will help you to, first of all, consciously be in control of always playing the F sharp and more deliberately playing the F sharp, but it'll also help to override what you've already programmed into the lizard brain. Another way to do it is do something else really different. Maybe change up the articulation just a little bit for this purpose of relearning it. Anything that you can do to make it sound a little bit different, feel a little bit different, will help to imprint the new image. Of course, if you do things like change articulations or dynamics, you want to make sure that you change them back pretty quick so that you don't learn the wrong articulations and dynamics, and it's like, when it's F sharp, it's forte, but with F natural, it's piano like it's supposed to be. You don't want to do that too much, but just a little bit to sort of break the pattern, interrupt what your brain automatically wants to do, will be really effective. One of my favorite ways to do this is dotted rhythms or practice rhythms, where instead of doing da 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 da, where it's perfectly even and steady, you sort of change up the rhythm for a little bit, da 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 da. Da 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 da. And that little bit of rhythm change is again a pattern interrupt and helps you to encode the information in a little bit different way that helps it to really stick. And that's sort of the whole magic behind all of those practice methods and practice rhythms and all of those different ways of simplifying, is that it helps to imprint the correct information onto the lizard brain, and sometimes it helps to imprint it faster and better as well. So I hope that this has been helpful. I hope that you try this out and sort of experiment with thinking about big brain versus lizard brain in your practicing. Always make sure that you're using your big brain to learn the music, to know how it's supposed to go correctly so that what you're imprinting onto the lizard brain is correct, and do those repetitions and do those practice techniques to imprint a really good image really firmly into the lizard brain so that you can always be consistent and confident in your performing. And if you want more on this kind of brain science of practicing, I highly recommend the book The Talent Code. It's a fantastic book that goes really in depth with this kind of brain science and has lots of fun anecdotes of really great sports teams and sports players and performers and how they sort of leverage brain science to become more effective at their craft. And I think we can leverage that brain science to become more effective musicians and clarinetists as well. So thanks for watching. Leave a comment if you found any of this interesting or you have any brain science or evolutionary science to add to the discussion. I'd love to hear that kind of stuff. Like the video if you like this kind of stuff. I think I could go a bit more actually into the science of practicing and things like that, so definitely let me know if you would like to see that, and of course subscribe so that you can see weekly clarinet and music tips and tricks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another video.